This video is the first of a two-part video on the immune system. Before we get into the mechanics of the immune system and how it works, we're going to talk about the pathogens that trigger the immune system. The learning objectives for this video are that you be able to list and describe the 6 types of pathogens, be able to identify a pathogen if it's given its characteristics, know discussed examples of the 6 types of pathogens, and describe the reproductive cycle of a virus. The immune system is the part of the body that defends the organism, in this case the human, against infectious diseases. In order to really understand what the immune system does, we have to understand first what is an infectious disease. An infectious disease is a disease caused by a pathogen. Now, what do we mean by a disease? Well, a disease is any state other than full health. So we have this negative connotation about the word disease, but disease just means that it isn't ideal. And this term disease can be replaced with other terms such as syndrome or disorder. All of them mean very similar things. Now, the symptoms are the things that make one less than healthy. Those symptoms of an infectious disease can be caused by the pathogen directly, such as weight loss from tapeworms. It used to be that people would swallow tapeworms in order to lose weight. Unfortunately, it turns out that weight loss is only temporary because as the tapeworm infection grows, appetite generally increases as long as food is available. Of course, if food is not available, then the weight loss will continue and that person will lose dramatic amounts of weight. But most of the time, the symptoms aren't due to the pathogen's actions directly. Instead, the symptoms of an infectious disease are caused by the body's response to the pathogen, such as a fever or runny nose or cough. All of these are things that the body does to try to get rid of a pathogen. And these responses are all part of what we call the immune system. Alright, so we say an infectious disease is a disease caused by a pathogen. We've talked about what a disease is. What is a pathogen? A pathogen can be a bacterium, that's the singular. Bacteria is the plural. Bacterium are prokaryotic cells, organisms that are single-celled, they're small in size, they lack a nucleus or other membrane-bound organelles. But they are cellular organisms, so they are considered living. Some characteristics that make them interesting is that bacteria have cell walls. They're not like plant cell walls chemically, but functionally they're similar in that they protect the organism and help give the bacterium structure. Just like a plant cell wall helps to give the plant cell structure. Bacteria also have another characteristic in that they produce structures called spores. Now, spores are little packages of DNA, and what's interesting about spores is they're like time capsules or seeds, where these spores can be released by the bacterium when the bacterium perceives the environment as being stressful, and therefore the bacterium may not be able to survive and divide normally. It'll produce spores, and those spores then go on and are preserved for a long period of time, sometimes decades. Then if conditions become better, if they improve, then the spores will germinate and the bacteria population can be reestablished from these spores. Bacteria are the target of antibiotics. So when we are given an antibiotic, it is because we have most likely a bacterial infection. Antibiotics are compounds that slow the growth of some pathogens. Now, most of the time, like I said, these are bacterial infections, but they can help treat protozoan and helminth infections, especially if those protozoans or helminths require bacteria in order to survive. So it doesn't kill those pathogens directly, it kills the bacteria that associate with those pathogens. Antibiotics are able to kill bacteria by inhibiting or blocking the ability of the bacteria to make proteins or to make that cell wall. Without being able to make the proteins that the bacterial cells need to survive, or without being able to make the cell wall that helps protect those cells, the cells then go on and die. Antibiotics don't work on viruses. This is a common misconception that people have. They believe that if they have a cold, they should go to the doctor to get an antibiotic. Well, a cold, we'll learn, is caused by a viral infection and therefore is not going to be treated by antibiotics because viruses make their proteins using the human system, and the human system is not impacted by antibiotics. And also, viruses do not have cell walls, so blocking the ability to make a cell wall will not hurt a virus in any way. Some examples of some diseases that are caused by bacteria are, for example, anthrax. Anthrax being a disease that received a lot of media attention back in 2001, not long after 9/11, when the World Trade Center was hit by terrorists. We received another scare when anthrax was sent in the mail to several news personalities and politicians. And because of anthrax producing spores, it's very hardy, and those spores were sent in the mail, and people opened the mail and inhaled the spores, and the spores germinated inside their lungs, and 5 people were killed because of these anthrax attacks. You may or may not know that leprosy is another type of disease that's caused by a bacterial infection, leprosy being an infection of the nervous system where eventually people start losing feeling in the extremities, and because of that they may be injured in those extremities and not realize it, and so those extremities can be threatened by secondary infections, and they may lose, for example, parts of their body because they didn't even know they were injured. There's a lot of misconceptions about leprosy, like that it's highly contagious. It's not. Actually, you can live with somebody with leprosy and never get sick. It's very hard to be contaminated. Many of us have a natural resistance to leprosy. Only a small percentage of the population is vulnerable to leprosy. It is carried by armadillos, so as armadillos are moving further north, we want to make sure that we avoid contact with armadillos. And leprosy can be treated. We have antibiotics that treat this infection. It's a long-term treatment. It's not a quick fix, but it can be cured. Another bacterial infection that you may not have heard about is Group B strep. And you might be thinking, wait, I know about strep. Yeah, you know about Group A strep. Group A strep causes sore throats and fevers, and just generally we feel gross. Group B strep does not cause any symptoms in a healthy adult, but it is a sexually transmitted infection that can spread between adults. Indeed, 50% of the American population is infected by Group B strep, and so it's spread very easily through sexual contact. The problem is that if a mother is infected with Group B strep and she gives birth to a baby, that newborn may develop Group B strep, and they are very vulnerable to this pathogen. And it can be life-threatening infection, and it's something that's completely preventable because late in pregnancy your doctor will ask, do you want to be tested for Group B strep? The answer is yes, you want to be tested to make sure that you do not have Group B strep, because if you do, they can just give you an antibiotic, give your baby an antibiotic, and prevent any problems further down the line. And then we compare that to Group A strep, which is the one that causes the sore throat and makes you miserable. And if you have a sore throat and it's a sustaining sore throat, especially if it comes with a fever, go to your doctor because you want to get antibiotics. Untreated Group A strep can have some long-term consequences. We see cases of scarlet fever. That is caused by a Group A strep infection that has not been treated soon enough. So it can go on and develop into scarlet fever, or rheumatoid arthritis is another thing that can be a consequence. And we're also having new research coming out that's showing that Group A strep can cause behavior changes, especially in children, where children can become incredibly well, their behavior changes. Their whole personality can change very dramatically due to a Group A strep. So get those sore throats checked. Meningitis is another disease that can be caused by bacteria. Actually, meningitis can be caused by several things, but what meningitis is an infection of the central nervous system. More specifically, there's this protective covering over your brain and spinal cord called the meninges. And when that tissue, that is the meninges, becomes infected by something like a bacterium, it swells, and that puts pressure on your brain and on your spine. And that can have life-threatening consequences. As a matter of fact, somebody can start sensing symptoms of meningitis, and within 8 hours they can be dead. It is a serious infection, and this is why you are asked to get vaccinated before you come to college. So many of us have had the vaccine against the bacteria that causes meningitis, because in college we're in close quarters and this bacteria is more likely to be transmitted. And the last example we're going to discuss for now is E. coli. E. coli is one of our foodborne pathogens, where it can be transmitted via food, or it can be transmitted if somebody hasn't washed their hands. And so E. coli is a natural bacteria. We live in happy harmony with E. coli. We need E. coli to help us digest our food, but certain strains or certain breeds of E. coli can make us very sick if it's in our food. And we've had several scares lately in the news of food being recalled because of E. coli contamination. Our second type of pathogens are the viruses. So we know about bacteria, and we probably know about viruses. And these are probably the two we primarily think about when we think about getting sick. Viruses are fascinating because they're not cell-based. They are not made up of cells, right? They're not prokaryotic, they're not eukaryotic, they're not cells. Many scientists argue they're not even living. I'll let you decide on that front. But they do have a genome. They do have DNA or RNA. So for some, it's DNA, just like it is for our cells or for bacterial cells. But for others, it's just a little molecule or a couple little molecules of RNA. And those molecules, the DNA or the RNA, is held inside a protein coat. So that protein coat, which is just a bubble, if you will, made up of many different proteins, that protein coat contains the genetic information, the genome. As you can see in this figure, the protein coat can come in many different shapes. Some are long and skinny, like Ebola has this very long, skinny protein coat. Some are more rounded. Some are spiky. Some are not. It's all different, depending on the type of proteins that are found in that virus and on that protein coat. What's interesting about viruses is that they require a host cell in order to reproduce. And so they're going to replicate inside that host cell. This figure shows how the reproduction of a virus looks, and this is just a generic figure. It's showing it for the influenza virus, but it could be any generic virus. And what I want you to do is pause the video and take a look and try to see if you can figure out from this figure what's happening in each step. All right, what's going on in steps 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Well, this is what I came up with. So the steps of the reproduction of a virus inside a host cell are the following. First, the proteins on the virus, those proteins associated with the protein coat, match up, a lot like a lock and key, if you will, with the proteins on a target host cell. This is how a virus is able to target a specific organ within the body. So for example, influenza only impacts our lungs, and that's because the virus only binds to our lung cells. All right. Other viruses target other parts of the body, like hepatitis targeting the liver, for example. If the host cell has the right proteins to match up to the virus's proteins, the virus can dock onto that host cell, and then it can enter the host cell. Once that virus has entered the host cell, the viral DNA or RNA, depending on what it has, goes into the host cell nucleus. And there it's treated like human DNA or RNA. It is used to do protein synthesis and to make either more copies of the DNA and RNA, in this case the viral DNA and RNA. So either we get DNA synthesis or we get transcription to make RNA. And then at the same time we also go through translation to make those viral proteins, the proteins needed for the protein coat and other proteins we aren't discussing today. Then all of those little bits and pieces, the DNA or RNA and the viral proteins, all of those assemble into multiple copies of the virus, and those multiple copies then leave the host cell. Sometimes they take a little bit of the host cell membrane with it, and that's what's being shown here in part 5 of this figure, that the virus is budding out and taking a little bit of the host membrane. That happens with influenza. It doesn't happen with everything. Sometimes they destroy the cell, and that kills the cell, and that cell is then no longer available to function as a human cell, and that can cause consequences to the host organism. So some examples of viral infections are, of course, influenza, the flu. And now there's some things to think about when it comes to influenza, like the symptoms. So what are the symptoms of the flu? When you get sick with the flu, how do you feel? What symptoms do you have? Well, if your answer to that question is, oh, I'm going to throw up, I might have diarrhea, you are wrong. All right, that is a misconception, because we call those symptoms we associate with something called the stomach flu, which is not the influenza, completely different virus. And this is important when we start talking about getting our annual flu shot. A lot of people think, oh, I got my annual flu shot and then 2 weeks later I got the flu. Well, if they were throwing up and having diarrhea, they didn't get the flu. They got a stomach bug, probably the norovirus or some other stomach-associated pathogen. That's not the influenza, and that's not what the flu shot protects against. Symptoms of the flu are going to be things like body ache, headache, coughing, but you're not going to have a whole lot of vomiting, and you're not going to have a lot of diarrhea with the influenza. When you have the influenza, you are knocked down sick. You cannot get out of bed. You have what's called malaise, where you just cannot move, you cannot function. And that can go on for 5 days. Whereas with the stomach bugs, those are typically very short-lived, usually only a day or two. With some that we've seen recently, yeah, we see it going on for 3 days, which just sounds miserable, but it's still not the influenza. So flu season arrives and you don't get your flu shot. Middle of December you come down with the influenza, the real thing, body aches, fever, headache, everything. What should you do? Should you go to the doctor? Should you get plenty of rest and fluids? Should you ask the doctor for antibiotics? Or is it some combination? Well, it's kind of up to you. But the one thing you absolutely should not do is ask the doctor for antibiotics, right? The flu is caused by a virus, and antibiotics don't work against viruses. You might want to go to the doctor, see what they're recommending that year. Some strains of the flu are treated by Tamiflu, which can help prevent or shorten the length of your flu illness. Other strains are not, and so when the doctor can't prescribe anything to help you, they're going to say stay at home, get plenty of rest, and drink fluids, but you don't need to see me unless it continues past like 5 days. And then you should probably go to the doctor, or in case your cough gets much, much worse. Otherwise, there's not much a doctor can do. Another example of a viral infection is the common cold. Now, the common cold is caused by several different types of pathogens, and it's just that it has a similar set of symptoms with each of these different pathogens. And so for each different species of pathogen that causes the cold, within that there are, of course, multiple strains. And so we can get a cold many, many times in our lifetime. More serious than the common cold is an HIV infection, HIV being the virus that then can result in the disease known as AIDS. And we're going to talk more about AIDS when we look at the immune system in the second part of our discussion on the human immune system. Just like we said that there are sexually transmitted infections that are caused by bacteria, there are also sexually transmitted infections that are caused by viruses, herpes being one. Now, herpes is transmitted other ways than just straight sex. It can be exchanged through kissing, for example. But this is a viral infection that can be exchanged through the direct exchange of fluids. We tend to think of herpes as being either genital or for example, around the mouth. But some strains can express themselves in other parts of the body, like this elbow here that's showing an outbreak of herpes. But it can be expressed in the genitalia. And so if you see this either on yourself or on somebody else, some steps need to be taken to reduce this infection, to help reduce the symptoms, and also to protect people from the spread of this particular virus. All right, so we have bacteria, we have viruses. Those are pathogens that most people know about. When people say, I'm sick, I've got a bacteria or virus, right? But it may not be just a bacteria or a virus. They could have a fungus. Fungi, we learned earlier in the semester, are eukaryotic. They have organelles, they have a nucleus, they are relatively large in size compared to our bacteria, for example. What you may not know about fungi is that they have cell walls. So like a bacteria, they have cell walls that help give them shape and structure. They're chemically different than bacterial cell walls. They're also chemically different than plant cell walls, but they serve a similar function. And fungal pathogens can be either single-celled, such as the case of a yeast infection, or the pathogen may be multicellular, such as the case as a mold, a black mold, for example. So thrush is an example of a disease that's caused by a single-celled fungus, a yeast infection. It can cause, for example, if you see patients in a hospital, they can be vulnerable to thrush in their mouths if they're on a respiratory aid, or you can see thrush as a diaper rash on a newborn baby. That environment, when you have a diaper that might be wet for a little while, that makes a nice warm wet environment that the fungi does well with, and it can cause an infection. Fungal infections can be more serious, and we're starting to see more of these more serious fungal infections. Typically, we see fungal infections on the surface of the skin. So, for example, thrush, which happens on the surface, and even your tongue is considered the surface of your body. But we're starting to see more and more infections that are happening more internally. For example, valley fever. Valley fever is a pathogen that was isolated to the southwest United States, and typically resided in the soil. And when conditions would get dry and when it get windy, the spores of the fungi in the soil would be picked up and carried, and people would inhale them, and so valley fever will infect the lungs of people. And these can be very serious infections that can be very difficult to treat because it's a eukaryotic organism, just like our cells, and so anything that we do to kill it could potentially harm our cells as well. And that makes valley fever, for example, very hard to treat. The problem with valley fever that we're seeing is because of climate change, we're starting to see valley fever move. Yes, it used to be isolated into the southwestern United States, and I had a student once who went on spring break to California and came home and was diagnosed with valley fever, for example. But now we're starting to see cases of people in Missouri who are getting it who have not traveled to the southwest. So we're starting to see valley fever move north and east. All right, pathogen. So it can be a bacteria, a virus, a fungus, or it can be a protozoan. This is a class of pathogens that we in the United States do not have a lot of personal experience with because we do not generally get exposed to protozoans, because protozoans are more common in untreated waters. And we aren't exposed to untreated waters. We have great sanitation, we have good wastewater management and filtering of our drinking water. And those are all luxuries that much of the world does not enjoy. And so even though protozoan infections are not a big deal here in the United States, they are the #1 killer among infectious diseases worldwide. Protozoans are also eukaryotic, so they're going to have organelles. They're going to be relatively large in size. Unlike our yeast cells, however, the protozoans do not have a cell wall. And that's a good thing because protozoans are frequently found in the water and they like to move. If they had a cell wall, they wouldn't be able to move. The most notorious protozoan infection is malaria. Malaria is the #1 killer among infectious diseases worldwide. Kills more people every year than any other disease caused by a pathogen. And malaria is a protozoan infection. It is spread by mosquitoes, so it lives half of its life cycle in a mosquito, and then the rest of its life cycle is in the human host. The fifth category of pathogens you may have even less experience with. You've probably heard of malaria, and you've probably heard of these helminths. You may not have heard them called that. Helminths are parasitic worms. So yes, they're similar to their earthworm cousins, right? But they're worms that can cause disease inside humans and other animals. And an example of a helminth is this tapeworm. And this tapeworm actually has an interesting story, because this tapeworm was extracted from a scientist who researches tapeworms, and he decided he wanted to get to know his organism more intimately. And so one night he decided to swallow the larvae form of this helminth. He did it very well. He did it with a glass of red wine, really classy. And when he did that, he introduced the tapeworm into his body. Then after a couple of months, he went ahead and took some medicine that would kill the tapeworm. The tapeworm was expelled out when he had a bowel movement, and this is the product. Now helminths, when we're looking at them, obviously they are multicellular. You can see them with the naked eye, therefore they must be made up of many cells, and they are multicellular, and they're eukaryotic, so they're going to have those organelles inside their cells. They're going to have nuclei, etc. They do not have cell walls, because that would limit their movement, so just like other animals, they lack cell walls. So I'll give you a warning on this one in case you're easily heebie-jeebied. You may not want to see some of these pictures. They may not bother you, but they might. So if you are easily bothered by imagery, why don't you go ahead and look away, and you can just listen to what I'm saying, and then I'll tell you when it's safe to look up. So here are some consequences that we see with these infections. We see things like with a tapeworm infection. The reason that tapeworms are a very bad idea is because they don't just stay in the gut. Up in the upper left-hand corner, you can see that a tapeworm has released larvae, and the larvae have traveled through the bloodstream to the brain, where they burrowed into the brain and created holes in the brain, and that causes brain damage, of course. You can see that over on the top right, you can see that these helminths can pack up the intestines, and so that can cause physical blockage and block the person's ability to digest their food, and can cause complications there. They can be very painful as well. And at the lower left-hand side, you see a child that has been given anti-helminth treatment and has expelled these worms outside his body as the worms died. And that is a very vivid image. I understand that. That's very repulsive, but I show it very specifically to illustrate that we here in the United States do not have to deal with this on a daily basis, but many parts of the world do. That this is a reality for many people, and an everyday thing. And so I guess what I want you to do is be more aware of the worldwide situation, that clean water and good sanitation are luxuries we have, not everybody enjoys, and the consequences of not having those can be dramatic. Okay, you can look up now. If you were looking down, you can look at your screen again. So helminths, they are considered parasitic because they feed on the host. And this is a very vivid image, I think, of a hookworm, of the opening of a hookworm. You can see where it gets its name. Up on top, we see the hookworm's mouth. And then down below, we see a side view when a hookworm has grabbed onto the lining of an intestine and is sucking the nutrients from that intestine. So hookworm is one of the few helminth infections that we do have to deal with here in the United States. Hookworm is found in the eastern United States. So if you went to Florida for spring break, sorry you spring breakers, but if you went to Florida for spring break, you might have been exposed to hookworm. Hookworm will enter through the bottom of your foot if you're not wearing shoes, and will find a blood vessel and travel to your bloodstream to your intestine. Now if you got one hookworm, not a big deal. Unfortunately, I had this happen once when I went to Florida, and I came back and I went over to the MU Health Clinic, and they correctly diagnosed it. They were able to figure it out. It took a few doctors and a lot of books, but they figured out what was happening. I didn't have any other symptoms beyond a red streak, as the hookworm went and found a blood vessel to enter. So I didn't notice any sort of weight loss or anything like that, because one hookworm does not do a lot of damage. Multiple hookworms do a lot of damage. So I was able to have my one hookworm. I named him George. There's no treatment. But multiple hookworms can be compromise the well-being of the person. Okay, we're flying through these pathogens, and I wish I could discuss more details of many different examples. I have many examples for each of these that are fascinating examples, but I am trying to be sensitive of your time, and I want to get through these different categories because this last category of pathogens is the one that we are the least familiar with. Many of us have never heard of prions. Prions are the most recently discovered. We're still learning a lot about prions because we really just kind of became confident that they were a pathogen in the 90s, really, is when we started to grasp the concept, because what these guys do is so incredibly bizarre. It's hard to believe that this is real. So a prion, that pathogen is one protein. We talked about how a virus is smaller than a bacteria, and a bacteria is smaller than a eukaryotic cell, for example. Well, a virus has a protein coat made of a bubble of many different proteins. If you took one of the proteins from that bubble, that would be about the same size as a protein that is a prion, or a prion that is a protein. So it's a single protein. It's a normal protein. It's a protein that we all have inside our nerve cells. It's required for normal nervous system function. It helps the nerve cells to send signals. And it's able to do that because it has a specific 3D shape, and that shape determines the function. Well, sometimes we develop what are called rogue proteins, and so we call them prions. The person who found them named them prions, so you can ask him why. But these rogue proteins have a bad 3D shape. So instead of folding properly in their normal configuration, they fold differently. And that difference interferes with their function, which you would think, okay, well, that's like any mutation that leads in a different folding of a protein. That could cause, that's more of a genetic disease, right? Well, the thing is that the genes of the people who have a prion infection, those are normal. They should make the normal protein, but they don't. And they don't because at one point they consumed a rogue protein, a rogue prion, and that rogue prion got into the nervous system. So this is very unlikely. These are not common, but this is how it happened. The rogue prions got into the nervous system and infected or changed the healthy proteins. So it took those proteins and changed their configuration, changed their 3D shape into this improper folding, into prion shapes. Very bizarre. So here's a figure showing how this might look. Here we have the healthy proteins are in purple. Somebody either consumes or is injected with one of the prion, the rogue proteins, and that rogue protein then interacts with these healthy proteins, and it starts changing those healthy proteins into the rogue configuration, the prion configuration. Another thing that's very frustrating with these prions is they cannot be destroyed by conventional means. So things that we've used in the past to sterilize, for example, surgical equipment, like exposing them to high temperature and pressure, which we call autoclaving, that sterilization doesn't destroy these prion proteins. Alcohol treatment doesn't work. Heat doesn't work. So a lot of radiation doesn't work. A lot of the things that we've used in the past will not destroy these prions. For whatever reason, they're very hardy proteins. So some diseases that have resulted from prions are all related. Really, there's just the one protein that goes wrong in all these different scenarios. But we see several different manifestations of this disease. And so we saw it back in the 90s when we had a lot of news about what we called mad cow, which is a horrible name for it. But it was because it was affecting cattle. And it was caused when farmers started taking cattle, and if you butcher the cattle, you get the meat, you get the good parts, and then you would have a whole bunch left over that wasn't desirable for human consumption. And so what they would do is they needed their cattle to have a good source of protein. So they would take those leftover parts and they would mash it all up, grind it all up, and put it back into the cow's feed. And so the cattle would be eating the remains of their of other cattle. Well, in that tissue there was nervous system tissue, and some of the cattle had a mutation that caused the prion to form, and others consumed it. And when they consumed it, the prions made their way into the nervous system of these cattle. And so they lost nervous system function, and so we see this cow is having trouble standing because of its prion disorder. Now that wouldn't be a problem because if you eat a cow that has mad cow, you generally eat the muscle. You don't eat the nervous system tissue, right? Steaks come from the muscle, hamburgers come from the muscle. But if you eat the tongue or if you eat the brains, as some people do, they consider those a delicacy, then you are eating nervous system tissue, and so you are exposing yourself potentially to acquiring prion, and that's exactly what happened. Is mad cow made the quote-unquote jump from cattle into humans, and humans had mad cow. Now, humans are the dead-end host in that we can't spread mad cow from human to human through any avenue except for cannibalism. And there were some cases. The Kuru tribe was a tribe that memorialized its dead by eating the dead, and they had cases of a disease. The tribe was the Four tribe, and the disease is Kuru, which was similar to this mad cow, and it was caused by a prion. So we've seen some historical references to it. Now we're not so much worried about our cattle. We're able to monitor our cattle, and we kill cattle that show early signs of this disease, and we make sure the bodies are destroyed. We don't feed cattle to cattle anymore. That practice isn't allowed. But we're starting to see the same thing popping up in our wildlife, in our deer populations, and that's here in the United States. And so any of you that are deer hunters might be interested in this, that you have to be careful and be informed on these prion diseases. How the deer are acquiring it, obviously the deer are not eating other deer, but when a deer dies, it goes into it decomposes into the grass, and the plants pick up the prion, and when another deer eats that grass, it acquires the prion that way. So very bizarre disease. It's infectious because it is acquired from the environment. So it's considered a pathogen because it's disease causing, and because it's reproducing inside the host using the host's own proteins. Very, very bizarre. Now this video has primarily focused on pathogens that are found in humans, right? But all living things have pathogens. Plants get sick, bacteria get sick, viruses infect bacteria. Everything can get sick because it can be infected by some other type of pathogen. Okay, after watching this video, hopefully you feel more comfortable with these learning objectives of being able to list and describe the 6 types of pathogens, being able to identify a pathogen if given its characteristics, whether it's eukaryotic, prokaryotic, multicelled, single-celled, living, non-living. Know the discussed examples of the 6 types of pathogens, and be able to describe the reproductive cycle of a virus. If you cannot meet any of these learning objectives, please let me know. We will get some more practice with them in class.